Should fiction change our worldview? Is it okay to do an unlibertarian thing to promote liberty? If you don't have religion, do you make your own God? We tackle these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through online social media feeds to find the best and the worst of what the internet's got to offer. And then we critique it and break down what's good or bad. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. And before we get started, just a reminder to follow us at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Leave a like, leave a comment. We appreciate it a lot. All right, we're going to start with recurring contributor to the show, whether he knows it or not, Joe Walsh. And he's quote retweeting Mediaite. I think that's how you pronounce it. I realize I've only ever read their publication name. I don't ever spoken it. And their headline reads, Joe Rogan guest arrested after head found in freezer. And Joe Walsh sort of satirically poking, tongue in cheek a little bit, says the whole Joe Rogan thing in a perfect nutshell, and then points down at the headline. So what do you think? Is this a semblance of a normal, rational take here?
No, I mean, even like, let's just take it as he maybe just trying to be a little bit funny. It's like, what amount of Joe Rogan's podcast would this like represent? Because this is like one of, I don't know, I think Joe Rogan's had like 1,500 or 1,600 episodes at this point. And if you want to flip the script around, right? Like if people are, if media podcasters or interviewers are represented by the behavior of their guests after they leave the show, I would have a lot to say about people like Joe Walsh and people that are on an actual media doing different types of interviews. Joe Walsh, former, was he congressman, right?
Yeah, he was a House of Representatives member.
House of Representatives. So it's like, okay, Joe, like if you are defined by the people you interact with, like I think that they could make a pretty big list of bad people that Joe Walsh has rubbed shoulders with or sat next to or talked with or anything like that. Not to mention his record on various amounts of things. So yeah, like what a like funny and silly thing to say about this. Joe Rogan has had tons of people on that are experts about lots of stuff, people that he doesn't agree with, right? Talking about things that they don't agree on the topic, but they're experts and he wants to hear about it and understand it. And it's like, what are you supposed to, if you're going to have discussion about anything in the world, like you're going to have people that are offensive to your worldview because you got to hear things that don't necessarily line up with that. There's going to be tension. There's going to be things that kind of break down. So the reason people don't like Joe Rogan is not because that, this one person, this one guest murdered someone. It's usually because like they just don't like the fact that Joe pushes people on stuff. And if you go on and you don't have a like ironclad worldview, it can get destroyed simply by a guy that is kind of a pothead just asking you questions that make sense. So that's why the media and people don't like Joe Rogan, is because he's just honestly asking questions. If you say something that doesn't make sense or something that you can't back up, you're kind of like, oh, like you look silly. There was that guy, Peter, I can't remember his last name, but he's like kind of the vaccine mascot doctor guy. And he went on Joe Rogan.
Dr. Gupta, right?
Not Dr. Gupta, different one. Peter,
okay.
Peter something else. He is very much overweight, very unhealthy looking. And he went on Joe Rogan right at the beginning, well, in the middle of the COVID pandemic when they started rolling out the vaccines. And he was advocating for like why they needed to take vaccines and all this stuff. And Joe Rogan's like, hey, like, that sounds good, but like, what do you do for your health, right? Like, you're a health expert, like you claim to be one. And he's like, oh, I don't eat as well as I should, And Joe was kind of like, oh yeah, like you kind of look like you don't. And Joe's like, well, do you take any vitamins? And he's like, no, I don't take vitamins. And Joe's like, well, you should probably exercise, at least go for a walk. You should probably take vitamins. Like, do you think that's like sound advice? And the doctor guy's like, oh yeah, but you should still take your vaccines.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a really crazy exchange. It's like, yeah, this world-renowned health expert who's considered, to be infallible is directing and recommending policy nationally for billions of people, or that will cascade to billions of people, can't answer whether or not vitamins are good for you and whether exercise is good for you or whether it's healthy to eat burgers and pizza every single night for all of your days. And it's like, yeah, he got torn apart by those simple questions. That's why people don't like Joe Rogan, is because he kind of exposes that. He has kind of a unique personality that can ask those types of questions and not come across as like, that comes across as just honest. Is like, hey, I'm genuinely trying to understand. I'm a dumb person trying to understand the point from a smart person, but even your smart quote unquote point doesn't make sense to this dumb person. That's why people don't like him. not, and Joe Walsh is trying to make the point that like, oh, when Joe Rogan has interviewers on, like people die. It's like, no, that's just not true.
Yeah, I think he's just kind of making like, oh, it's Joe Rogan has these weird kooks on and they're all just crazy psychos, or this, this is what are you going to get when you get someone like this asking the questions? And it's just such a, even if you're being tongue in cheek, you really do betray your disdain for open dialogue and discussion. And to me, it's one of those things where I appreciate being able to hear perspectives that I would never hear otherwise, from the media. Oh, and I think it was Dr. Peter Hotez, by the way. Is that
Yes.
who
Yep.
you were?
Peter
Hotez, yeah.
Hotez.
Yeah, and I just appreciate, from people I outright agree with, people I outright disagree with, or from people who I would never otherwise listen to, or even know that their perspective exists. And Joe Rogan earnestly asks questions, and sometimes people say he doesn't push back hard enough. And frankly, to me, that's there are certain times when it might be nice. There are times where I think he definitely pushes back a lot and challenges people. But the other thing is that I appreciate that he does go into the conversations knowing what he knows and not pretending to know what he doesn't
Yes.
know. And so if he doesn't have the things to push back on, he doesn't have this prescribed narrative that he doesn't know about, he's not going to push back. He's just going to keep asking, and he never commits to one thing because he's not going to be, oh, this one person told me this and this is the gospel truth. If he doesn't know, he doesn't know, and he'll just keep asking questions. So I think that the disdain for Joe Rogan having interesting or wide perspectives on is really a fundamental betrayal of the kind of worldview that you have. Even if you're making a joke here, it shows that in your perspective, the Joe Rogan podcast, oh, well, that's kind of kooky and weird. I prefer my news from the acceptable crowd, the acceptable sources. Even if Joe Walsh would claim that, there are good podcasts and there are good alternative media, he would definitely be of the type of, well, you can't listen to Joe Rogan. He's not in the in crowd kind of thing. When I host my podcast or when I am a guest on another podcast, that's where we have actual civilized intellectual debate. The Joe Rogan thing, that's just look at this kook who listen on. I think that's really disingenuous and sad, frankly.
Yeah. Hey, I was talking with someone fairly close to me about it because they just kind of don't like Joe Rogan. I don't think they've ever listened to a Joe Rogan episode.
Yeah.
Because I posed this hypothetical. I was like, hey, do you think that like the current way that, corporate media runs interviews where it's like you get maybe at the most 5 to 10 minutes to talk in a segment, maybe, and most of it's like try and get the the headline article, just quick summary in. Do you think that's more transparent, or do you think having a 2-3 hour conversation with one of the best representations of the opposing side it would be a better case scenario, and a 2 to 3 hour open conversation where you've got someone that's able to Google things as they come around, and like it's obvious, right? It's like you can't even really argue with the point, and it's like, yeah, that's the Joe Rogan show. Like whether or not you like his personality, whether or not you like that he likes UFC or has certain viewpoints, like his show is a 2 to 3 hour podcast with someone that knows the issues at hand. And then you have a dumb guy on the other side, Joe Rogan, asking honest questions, and then another dumb guy Googling and being able to pull up stuff and ask further questions and allowing the expert to explain. And if they can't explain, then too bad, right? If you can't explain it to Joe Rogan, you probably don't have a really good position because the guy is like perfectly, does all of his conversations in good faith. At least that's how he performs them when you're able to listen. And it's really sad that like people are so committed to their tribe that they're willing to destroy like a really honest piece of discourse that we've got going on in our society. One of the largest, right? Like he's the largest podcaster in the world.
Yeah, well, and it's one of the signs I think of a good podcast that explores ideas is when clips go viral, when it's not just the host speaking. And there's so many times when guests of Joe Rogan will go viral for something that makes some people really angry and some people really excited, because those ideas don't get to be expressed in the short form content you were alluding to earlier. You get to a point in the conversation where you can really elucidate a topic, and you've given all of the precursor context that's needed to then say sort of the punchline almost. So, a clip of maybe a minute or 30 seconds of someone speaking, it's so fundamentally different when it comes from the Joe Rogan experience than a media clip from someone on NBC. Because on MSNBC, it's like, okay, you've got maybe 2 minutes to set up the context, and then you've got your punchline that's 30 seconds or a minute. Uh, you can only go so deep with that. And frankly, there is a spot for that kind of shorter form overview summary to help convince. But when you can get the really the heart of the issue, and you can lay out all of the context needed in hours if needed, or 30 minutes, and then you can get to why something is the way that it is, or how you should be viewing something, then those are the clips that are really powerful. It's more than just, again, a shallow headline and bumper. And I appreciate that. And the way that Joe Rogan asks questions too, it actually reminds me of Columbo. If you're familiar with the old detective show Columbo, how he the detective sort of enters the scene, and he acts as kind of a bumbling doofus a little bit, sort of scatterbrained and lost, and he tends to put the criminals disarm them a little bit, where he sort of has all these disconnected questions, seems to kind of miss things, and asks really, really dumb seeming questions. And then he'd always kind of be like, oh, and one more thing, or just something's kind of bugging me. And he would have these very, again, disarming, until piece by piece he clue it, and they kind of figure out he's onto them. And to me, that's kind of how Joe Rogan, I wouldn't say, is like piecing this all beforehand. He's not like this mastermind who's doing that. But the way that he asks the questions has kind of a same effect, where if someone doesn't know what they're talking about, and they have this facade of grandeur, and I would say this was the case of what I was thinking with Dr. Gupta, where Dr. Gupta, he's a doctor, he's on CNN, he has all this, he has the arm of the mainstream media and the arm of science behind him, arguing. And then Rogan just kind of was like, okay, well, there's just one more thing. If you were to say, what's better, like to be young and healthy, or to take a vaccine, like what would you recommend? Just asking sort of the low common denominator questions that really, when someone is that high up, they almost feel like no one's going to bother to look at the foundation that I stand on, because I have all the credentials. And
Yeah.
and the mainstream media is like, well, he's got the title, he's got the show, he's got the again, the narrative behind him, so of course what he's standing on is solid. And Joe Rogan's like, okay, well, we'll slow your roll here. Let's check that foundation. Like, what about the very basic questions, the very basic building blocks that all your other assumptions rely upon? Are those sound? And that's what I appreciate about what the way that Joe Rogan asks questions, even if you're like, he doesn't push back hard enough, or he has kooks, or he has weirdos. Like, he has everyone on, and he treats them pretty much all the
Yes.
same in that sense. And that's great. Okay, we'll move on to the next take. This one comes from the take comes from Justin Peters, who's responding to Gavin Ortland, who are both Reformed churchmen. So the original tweet from Gavin Ortland reads, "What work of fiction changed your worldview the most? Mine is Till We Have Faces. I cannot think about redemption the same way after reading it. Two runners-up would be Lord of the Rings, for how it conveys glory, and Brothers Karamazov, for how it poses the problem of evil." And before I get to the take, I just want to say my heart swelled reading this, because Till We Have Faces has long been like my favorite book, and Brothers Karamazov has been like a runner-up in more recent years when I read that. And then I just finished reading Lord of the Rings, which I also adore.
Nice.
So I'm like, all three of these are just really glowing. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like these are so perfect. I knew Gavin Ortland was a little bit of my spirit animal here. Okay, so anyway, Justin Peters responds saying, "None. No work of fiction should ever change our worldview. As a Christian, my worldview is shaped by scripture alone." All right, what do you make of that take? And just a reminder, we're all friends here. We're not hating for bad takes.
Yes, I really like Justin Peters. I mean, you've told me a bit about Gavin Ortland. I love his take. I was just thinking about Till We Have Faces this morning, as I was thinking about something going on in my life, and just what I was like, I should probably read that again. That and The Great Divorce, like just fantastic pieces of fiction. And I guess I would ask Justin Peters. I like Justin Peters a lot. I'm going to keep saying that because I a lot of his work has been really good. But this is a bad take from him. I guess to grant him as much credence as I can, like, yeah, I don't think any work of fiction should ever change our worldview to the extent that it contradicts scripture, right? Like, right. I think all fiction should change our worldview to the extent that scripture would also change our worldview,
or that it elucidates scripture.
Yeah,
right?
Elucidates scripture. Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. That's a great way to put it. And like, I was just thinking about like the thing that popped in my head the first time I saw this take when we were going through it before the show is that It's like, yeah, like Jesus used works of fiction in his parables when he was talking to people to make points.
Exactly.
And our church right now is going through the David's and Bathsheba, like the story of David and Bathsheba, and Nathan in the story, the prophet Nathan uses the fictional story of, you know, a rich man taking a poor man's sheep to convict David. He doesn't use, you know, some quote from Moses or, you know, from Genesis to convict David. He uses a work of fiction, and then he draws it back to scripture, right? As like all good fiction should do. It should elucidate scripture. It should echo the timeless truth. And so it's like, I guess I would ask Justin Peters, like, okay, so then if no work of fiction should ever change our worldview, then should, like, if we grant that is true, like, and what's the point of any writers writing any fiction at all? Like, the whole point of, is it just for entertainment? Like, I would say that's the worst form of fiction, is fiction that just serves to like kind of light up your monkey brain for a little bit, like Transformers, and then you turn it off and you're good. Like, the best type of fiction is the one that lays out a timeless truth and calls you back to it and makes you like excited and makes you think about things in a different way, or not in a different way than scripture, but in just in the way that you're acting in the world, and that brings your worldview more in line with scripture. And I think it's very hard to make a case for the fact that like literature that does that is bad. Yeah, I'll let you go.
Yeah, I think again the most generous interpretation is that he's meaning changing your worldview, meaning making a fundamental paradigm shift in your worldview. But I don't think that's fair either, because
No.
the way that he's coming from it almost presupposes you're a Christian, where like you know, think about asking this question to someone who was raised outside the church and then came to Christ through works of fiction. Think about someone who is not a Christian reading Till We Have Faces, and that being almost their first exposure to the gospel, and then saying, yeah, that book changed my worldview. That, of course that's a great thing, of course that's a positive thing, and it led them to elucidate scripture. So I think that again, even the most generous interpretation I would take issue with, because then it's just a matter of timing of whether or not something should anything other than scripture changes your worldview, because maybe people are literally exposed to the gospel and scriptures through works of fiction. I would also be curious if, and I genuinely don't know, but I would think in order to be somewhat consistent, or at least maybe not necessarily you have to hold to this, but it would be a similar rationale in my mind if he would hold to the only type of singing worship being singing the psalms, which can be a reformed thing. Some people really do hold to that, and
Yeah.
whereas I think that good hymn writing or you know, praise choruses or poetry, for instance, like the psalms but not the psalms, I think those can also change how you consider the truth of the scriptures and how you understand them and relate them to you. I mean, it's one of those things where I think if you are making the argument that every human can sit down, open the Bible, read it, and with no extra help be inspired and understand them perfectly, I think that's just misguided. I really do. You often will need the institution of the church to help again elucidate or enlighten what things mean and make connections for you. And so by that logic, someone's preaching helps change your worldview. Now it's again through scripture, but like you said, the best stories are the ones that reflect the truth of the gospel of the Christian worldview. And so in that way, something like Till We Have Faces, Lord of the Rings, Brothers Karamazov, they are what's changing your worldview from them is the truth of the scriptures, but it's just helping you understand it in a different context. And so that's what I think a lot of preaching does. I think that's what a lot of study with other people who help explain connections to you do. But rarely are you actually going to just sit down, read the Bible through with no other aid, and then be like, I understand everything perfectly that the scriptures are trying to teach here, and my worldview will never change from what it is now. Oftentimes, understanding scripture in light of explanation, study, or again, reframing through fictional narratives, it helps you synthesize what the scriptures teach with real life or with people or all kinds of situations. And so in that way, I think fiction has a very important role to examine beauty, to examine, like he says, conveying glory, for instance. You think about like the Divine Comedy and in particular the Paradiso, like that is a very profound and bizarre but really beautiful way of conveying glory, and it helps you think about it in ways that you would not before and might shift your worldview about it, which is can be a good thing.
Yeah, I wonder if Justin Peters watches movies or like enjoys reading fictional books, because like I just can't see if you're not open to like because it's like change of worldview, like to me that's like learning, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that's almost synonymous with learning. And it's like, okay, like one of the things I just rewatched the show True Detective, the first season, the good season, recently. And it's just like, wow, like I love watching this, even though I know what's gonna happen because I've watched it 3 other times. Like, even though I know what's gonna happen, I love watching it because there's little intricacies and details that the characters lay out and positions that the characters lay out that just makes me think about life, in a more rich way, and not in a way that is, that contradicts scripture or anything, but in a way that like actually enhances it. Like I think of scripture as I watch True Detective, which is really funny and interesting. It also, yeah, they do just a great job in that show. Um, you know, it, it's just kind of I can understand why he's saying this though, on the flip side, because like there is a tendency. Are you familiar with like Frank Peretti?
Yeah.
So like Frank Peretti had that I think it was like Piercing the Darkness and This Present Darkness,
Yeah.
two sister books that kind of like lay out a their fictional way of like how spiritual warfare occurs or
Uh-huh.
whatever.
Uh-huh.
And I think in recent memory, I think Frank Peretti's like Assemblies of God, which is a Pentecostal denomination. You know, in recent years with those types of books and others, like Pentecostals kind of like I remember we played at a church as a band, and I had a guy come up and talk to me. He's like, "Yeah, it's really incredible when you strum, your guitar, angels actually like ride the sound waves, and there's certain types of frequencies that they're able to ride better than others." And you're just like, "Dude, come on, man. That's just a little bit too much. Like that's not based in scripture anywhere." At all. That's informed by your own little like fictional universe you've built up in your head. And Justin Peters would also take issue with it in the same way that I'm taking issue with it.
Yeah.
And I think this is kind of a reaction maybe to
Yes.
that. And like, because it is like if you're not actually grounded in scripture and truth, then yeah, like something even as good as the Lord of the Rings that does echo truth that is in the scripture could be twisted and taken and destroyed. Because really, at the end of the day, as long as if something's not anchored in scripture, then yeah, you are kind of adrift at sea. You're anchorless without any ability to land anywhere. So I understand why he's saying it. I just think it's a lot of an overreaction.
Yeah, I think the problem is he says no work of fiction should ever change our worldview.
Yes.
No work of fiction ever. That's the imperative phrase there. I think what makes sense is no fictional truths should ever change our worldview. That would make a lot more sense to me because the
Yeah.
truths in fiction aren't fictional truths if they're based in reality, right? Even from quotes. I mean, like think about this. Like should people who are not the gospel writers or Jesus, should they be able to change our worldview, like sources outside the Bible, basically? And I think the answer is yes. If the truths that they are speaking are biblical truths, then those people should change our worldview to align more with Scripture. I think, I mean, like the quote from C.S. Lewis about there are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. Talking about the fact that God created every individual as a unique thing. That whole quote that changed my worldview in a way that I keep reminding myself and how I interact with people. But that's because the truth he said is not a fictional truth. It's not even it's not a truth that's not found in the gospel, even if that quote isn't found in the gospel. It's a truth extrapolated and applied outside of the gospel's specific wording and scripture's specific wording, but it's the truth from that. And in the same way, I would argue Brothers Karamazov and Till We Have Faces and Lord of the Rings, they convey very real truths through fiction. So don't change your worldview because of fictional truths. But fiction can direct you and change your worldview to point it towards the ultimate truth, which I think is probably what Gavin here is talking about, not orienting your entire worldview to align with Left Behind or something like that.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
All right. We've got two takes from Dave Smith today. The first one is the following. Here's a hypothetical thought experiment for libertarians. A radical libertarian has infiltrated the Department of Education. He has a group of undercover radicals with him, and they have the ability to control the department, but they cannot abolish it. The radical undercover libertarian calls you to explain the situation. He says, I can't abolish the department, but I can make Mises, Ron Paul, and Murray Rothbard mandatory curriculum across the country. Do you A, explain to him that the correct libertarian position is to abolish the Department of Education and that he's become an advocate of big government. Tell him that whether kids are taught Rothbard or Marx in government schools, it's not libertarian. Or B, drop to your knees and thank God that these people infiltrated the department and obviously encourage him to make these changes that will drastically change the country in our favor. All right, what's the hypothetical? And are you a true libertarian, Britt? Because if you're a true libertarian, you'll say, I can't do hypotheticals.
Yeah. Yep. The and others would say that we exist entirely within a hypothetical bubble. But,
Yeah.
yeah. So for those of you, if you've listened to us for this long, you all know that like we're libertarian and we don't believe in public schools or anything like that. But I would choose B for the most part. It's like okay, like I'm glad that like this is more of a step towards liberty than a step away. And like as much as A seems like it's like the purest position, it actually is a step away from advocating for a cultural shift and everything like that. So I don't like have a ton to say on it other than I would choose B because I think it's more in line with getting towards a more free world. And kind of like the I think we're going to talk about this taking a little bit like if you have certain worldviews and you believe in truth and you believe in like you believe in something, like you believe that there's a God and that there's a moral law and that it's written in our hearts, you know, regardless of how you kind of choose to phrase that, like there's like, okay, like things that are more in line with that truth are better for us to have in society. And just because I don't necessarily like the institution that it's that type of alignment is being brought in doesn't mean that alignment isn't good. Right. And so, like, if anything, this is just a little bit of a step in the right direction when it's obviously been running full tilt in the wrong direction for so many years.
Yeah, it's kind of like the argument that, should you take over a government position in order to destroy the government position, right? Um, you know, if you were actually going to be even more actually about this to an absurd degree, if you choose A, saying the correct libertarian position is to abolish the Department of Education, blah blah blah, that kind of logic, if you took that to its logical extreme, would also say that no libertarian should ever run for office, should never be appointed to any government position, because merely by sitting in that position, even for a day, you are violating the non-aggression principle because you are enacting a coercive measure. Even if your first act was to abolish that department or to dissolve it, you would be doing something with the use of force that was not that was coerced in a sense. You're coercively destroying a government department against the government department's wishes. So, if you were being really, really, really particular about this, that's where that line of logic leaves you. Now, alternatively, I also don't think that you are required to answer B. If, for instance, if this hypothetical was, you can get into the Department of Education and you have the choice between mandating Karl Marx or Lenin. It's like, or Engels, like picking those two where it's like, is one slightly worse or better than the other? Well, at that point, clearly, even if one's, or even mandating reading of Marx and like Thomas Piketty, right? Like those things where I also think that there is no really good outcome there either. Even if one is less bad, it's still to the point of being atrocious and bad. Part of the problem that no pun intended there, that's Dave Smith's show name. Part of the problem with a lot of libertarians is that they're unable to make wisdom judgments and like value calls where it's like, they all say, oh, I'm never going to vote for the lesser of two evils. Where to say, well, that matters. Like if it's a 5% difference, then I understand your logic. You're not really doing much of anything. But if you're talking about, yeah, like what I'm doing is not great here, that there is evil here, but the good is overwhelming versus everything about this is evil, well, then of course I'm going to pick the evil that has a lot of good with it. And that's where the arguments debate, whether or not, where you draw that line and what value you have. But I think to ignore that is crazy. For instance, to say like, oh, we have to use the power of government to destroy government, I think that's a futile argument. I don't think that's the way we should go. But if I have to vote for someone whose perspective is we have to use the government to destroy the government by enacting a bunch of laws that try to ban things that may or may not work, I'm going to go with that versus the person who says, no, government power is a good thing. Like, even if I think that the first perspective is wrong and that creating powers, that's clearly a better option and at least gets you set on the right framework. So that's one of the problems I have with libertarians is they think everything is a can't vote for the lesser of two evils, and it's like, well, no, you can. It doesn't mean you always have to, and that you're required to if there's a 1% difference. But also, you have to use your judgment. You just can't take sort of the shelter of if it's not perfectly libertarian, I won't support it.
Yeah, it as you're talking about it, it reminded me of like Tim Pool used to be fairly on the left, like went to the We Are the 99% marches and stuff like that, and I remember him being like, "Oh yeah, I actually supported Ron Paul in 08 and 12 because even though I didn't agree with him on any of his fiscal stuff, and obviously he was a lefty and liberal, not a Republican or anything like that. He's like, what was nice about Ron Paul was that like I knew that if he got into office, like I would still be able to go do what I wanted to do,
Yeah.
and Tim Pool has since come around. He's very close to being fairly based on like libertarian stuff. I think it also comes with him owning and running a business and things like that. Like
Yep.
you just can't, you run into a factor of reality that you just cannot ignore anymore. And it inevitably leads you to being more free market and just understanding how the world works. But like that's the benefit, right? Of like someone that is more, even though Ron Paul occupies a position, would if he hypothetically, and it would be awesome, you became president, even though he occupies a position that we take so much issue with, and we, for the most part, say like anyone who occupies that position automatically becomes a tyrant and is bad. Like I would still be very, very thankful and excited and happy if Ron Paul ever became president,
Right.
because it's like, oh yeah, like everyone else is going to now live a more virtuous, ideally have the opportunity to live a more virtuous life in the way that they freely, without having to be forced to or coerced or anything like that. And that it's a step towards that. And even someone like Tim Pool, coming from that lefty standpoint, just reasoning it out, I was like, oh yeah, like everyone would be better off, right, if someone with these types of world viewpoints went into office. And at the end of the day, like you get some libertarians that like very much will hold to the libertarian worldview, even when someone makes a point like, oh well, the world would be worse off because of this, and they're so dogmatic. Well, that's good. That's just how it's supposed to be. But the beautiful thing about our philosophy is that like it might lead to things that are kind of bad in the interim, but in the long term, like libertarian principles they actually work. They're the only thing that works because they're the only thing that's actually in line with reality and the science of human action. When you ignore that huge science, when you ignore the incentive structures, when you ignore that people act, then bad things happen and like weird things occur in the marketplace. And when you actually acknowledge it, then good things happen. And that means that it's like it's most in line with reality. And so that's our worldview. Not only like just because someone might get in the position where they're a tyrant, they technically occupy a seat that is tyrannical, but they are playing out and moving us towards a system that actually works. Like that's a good thing, right? And I don't want to take steps backwards. I like taking steps forwards.
Yeah, exactly right. Yep. And the closest example I can think right now is would you rather vote for Justin Amash, who maybe is a little too blue pilled for my liking when it comes to libertarians, or Mike Rogers, who voted for every single American spying action? And it's like, well, Amash voted for Trump's impeachment, that was not right because it was not actually like over good evidence and stuff, or Amash maybe isn't as libertarian as I'd want in certain. Yeah, but it's versus Mike Rogers,
Yep.
like the guy who will literally
No-brainer.
sell your data to the government and turn every spying apparatus on. If
I mean, we did that that Gandalf versus Saruman meme. Like that's more in line with that, right? Like,
yeah,
it's like yeah, like they're both are a little bit blue pilled, but like one, like you're saying, is going to would like to enslave you, and the other is just kind of like like I didn't like Trump,
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
There's levels to this.
Yes. All right. Our next take comes from Peachy Keenan, who tweets, democracy is when American politicians decide who gets to be president. Spreading democracy abroad is when American politicians decide who gets to be president in other countries. What do you make of this take here?
This is good and pretty funny. Like it's the first part, like I think most people like kind of nod along with that, right? And it's supposed to be like shot chaser. Spreading democracy abroad is when we decide over in other countries. Both are bad, right? And like both are not actually democracy, which is pretty funny about it. But the part that got me, is obviously the second part. It's like, yeah, we are big fans of democracy in other countries, and that involves us going in there, installing our own puppet governments, denying the will of the people, and silencing opposition through death, torture, and murder, and starvation. Like that's American democracy abroad. And people think about people think well, why do people hate Americans so much, or why are people in this country or that country, like what motivated them to fly planes into the two towers? It's like, well, it's because we killed 500,000 children in Iraq through starvation. It's like those are the types of things we did in the name of oh well, we want to free Iraq from Saddam Hussein and things like that. It's like, I guess the cure is worse than the disease that we've been talking about. I can't remember who I heard laying forth this. It must have been on an Instagram story, actually. I have a friend who's from Ukraine and has family over there, and obviously they're in a very bad spot and everything. I definitely feel for them, but doesn't quite, as arrogant as it might sound for me to say this person that is from there doesn't quite understand some of the history, because they said something oh yeah, well, Putin, we need to, even if Ukraine repels the invaders, we need to have permanent U.S. troops in Ukraine, because if we don't, Putin will come in and he will install his own puppet government and overthrow, all these different people and this stuff, and it's still going to be basically Russia. And it's like, dude, why do you think Putin's invading right now? Because we went in there, installed our own puppet government right on his border, and brought NATO right to his doorstep. And then we have the balls to say that he's right on NATO's doorstep. So it's just we do these awful things all the time. There's a reason why people don't like the United States and take issue with it. The Tucker Carlson Putin interview and many of the interviews that Putin has done, I can't remember the one he did with one of the mainstream outlets, but basically saying yeah, I've killed people, but you don't think your CIA and FBI have killed people? It's just a really funny little bit, but it's it's true. It's yeah, we'd like to pretend that we're the good guys and we have these morals and stuff. But in reality, it's it's actually the elites are the same across all countries, and they all are doing awful things and bad things. We just have the most amount of firepower and the most amount of political will, and we end up starving people in other countries. And it's not the reason they fly planes into our towers is not because they hate us for our freedom. They hate us because we tried to spread our version of freedom, which is killing their people in their own country.
Yeah, and it's really just funny because democracy is shown as this crazy value that is just the most important that anyone could ever fathom. We're taught to treat democracy like it's this unassailable right, and then we go into countries and impose democracy on them in the name of oh, we're liberating the people. But then the moment that the people speak out in a way that we don't like, we're never pro democratic. And it's funny because you look at the international justifications for certain actions, and it betrays how little a value democracy actually is to the class. Because, for instance, one of the things that will be said about from the foreign policy establishment who want to go in invading, in particular with the Israel-Palestine situation, is they'll say, look, Hamas in a poll would still get reelected from Palestine. Therefore, bombing innocents is okay because the people are culpable. But it's very funny because it's okay, so clearly your value of democracy actually isn't that high if you're using democracy as the justification to bomb the Palestinians because they want to be represented by Hamas. Again, whether or not that's true. And I'm not even saying that they're wrong in that case. If you said that there was an overwhelming amount of people who supported a terrorist cell, there's probably a little bit of culpability there for sure. I don't know that it justifies them being bombed too, unless they're actively taking action in unjustified ways. But regardless of that, the merit of that debate aside, it shows how flimsy a value democracy really is when it comes to right and wrong. And so you also recognize the people who are claiming to champion democracy, they actually don't care about democracy because they see through that. They know that it's just this thin veneer of an excuse that they use to try to justify their invasions, but they don't actually care about that, and they don't actually engage in real democratic reforms. They make sure that the people that get into power align with American values. That's why, for instance, you have the whole Shah situation in Iran, when the U.S. goes in and installs their people, and then the people there decide, no, we want our guy in, and they chase the Shah out. and then we have this whole hostility towards Iran thing. So democracy is never the real value. And so it's funny because, this tweet of Peachy Keenan describing what democracy actually is, this is the real value that
Yes.
they have. They have the value that they are in control. So democracy doesn't mean the people control. It means the bureaucrats and the politicians are the ones who decide. And that's what real democracy is. And that's why, for instance, Trump is a threat to democracy, because they didn't pick him. That's basically it.
Did you are you kind of familiar with some of the stuff going on in Haiti right now?
I've heard like things about it, but I haven't I haven't looked into it yet.
So I think a lot of people have seen it, but basically, like, there's a whole cannibal like uprising within Haiti, and the president like fled the country, and no joke, a cannibal leader whose nickname is Barbecue is now the de facto leader of Haiti.
Oh no.
It's nuts, man. Some really disturbing videos and things. Even if only 10% of it's true, it's still very scary and sad. But I think it was the Libertarian Party or similar Twitter page, like, tweeted out like a brief history of Haiti, in the 20th and 21st century. And like, I didn't know a lot of this stuff, but like the French basically went in there and they colonized or whatever. And when they left, like they leveraged a bunch of like debts upon the Haitian government. Really unfair, really bad. And then over the course of, several decades, those debts eventually went to like U.S. bankers. And this is during the time of Woodrow Wilson. So if you need more reason to dislike Woodrow Wilson, like, you've got it right here. So Woodrow Wilson, to protect the interest of our bankers, use the excuse of like, oh, well, we need to bring stability to Haiti, and so occupied it with military might. And I can't remember, I'll find it and maybe I'll post it or something. But this thread just basically lays out the whole history of like how we got to this point. Why is if you've got this there's Haiti and then there's the Dominican Republic, both on basically the same landmass. One side is doing pretty good, the DR, and then the other side has got cannibal gangs, running it. What led to that? What caused that? Both similar demographics, same landmass, all these different things. It's like, oh yeah, like there are other types of interests at play, right? And so, if you're familiar with it at all with Woodrow Wilson's like history, his loyalty to the bankers and the elite in our country and using military to like secure their interests did not stop at Haiti. Obviously, it most famously was used to tip the scales in favor of certain sides during World War I, which led indirectly to the uprising of Nazi Germany and stuff like that. So the American politicians, they're not even really loyal to America people, right? Like they will try and say like, oh, well, we need to do democracy abroad to like secure our interests. If we don't fight them over there, we'll fight them here. They don't even care about that. They would actually love to fight them here if it meant that the people that they care about and that they have, special interest with would become rich. So their interests are not, even in foreign countries, when they say it's about you as an American person, that would be a step in the right direction. And eventually it would lead to like total isolationism, because in America, we don't need to be fighting wars over there to not fight them over here. But it's not even that bad. Like these guys only have interest for the elites. And sometimes it's not even the elites in our own country, it's elites in other countries.
Well said. I knocked it out of the park. I think we'll move on to our last take. Is that right? Yes. This is our last one. And this is the second Dave Smith take that we alluded to earlier. When you don't have God, whatever your highest value is becomes your God. If you are an atheist who doesn't have kids, that God tends to be yourself, or your conception of yourself, your identity. This is a particular problem for libertarians who are atheists, childless, or unmarried. Libertarianism often becomes their God, and their identity as a libertarian becomes their religion, when it was only ever supposed to be your legal theory. And because they are trying to make it something much bigger than what it was supposed to be, they end up getting the theory wrong.
Mm-hmm.
This is why goofy woke libertarians will say things like being trans doesn't violate the NAP, so why do you care? When NAP standing for non-aggression principle. When libertarianism has nothing to say about caring. All libertarianism tells us is that I can't beat a trans person over the head with a club or support the government doing it. It doesn't tell me that I have to pretend a dude in a dress is a woman. This is also why some libertarians recoil at hypotheticals or real-world situations where there aren't perfect libertarian solutions currently available. I guess my point is that you should be a libertarian, and it's fine if that's a part of your identity, but there should be things you value way above it. God, family, friends, community, being a decent person should all be more important to you than your legal theory. Okay. Well, a lot there to unpack.
I almost don't want to add to it because it's such a good take. Like I
Just end episode.
yeah,
Done.
you could end it with it because I mean, this has been sprinkled throughout, our podcast
Absolutely.
history. Talk about this because you and I are both Christians, and we both obviously like there's our Christianity and God way up here, and then way down here is libertarian, legal theory and stuff. And libertarian legal theory only suits us in as much as that it leads to a world where we think it mirrors what our belief in God and the moral law, and that's the good news, right? That's the reason I am a libertarian, is because I believe that it is the legal theory that most aligns with the moral law that I have because of my belief in Jesus Christ and in God. And I really like his point about if you're an atheist who doesn't have kids, that God tends to be yourself or your conception of yourself, your identity. And you and I have talked about this, and we were just talking about it before the show, like with your dog and stuff. Like you get married and like there is a death to self, like there's like, and that death to self occurs because you realize like, oh man, in order for this marriage to work, like I have to give myself up in the service of something larger than myself. And that being our marriage, and like the things that I wanted before and that I could like basically choose freely of my own accord, I no longer can choose freely of my own accord because it's on condition of being faithful to someone else. And then you have kids or you have a dog or anything else, and
Well,
like
to be
that's
clear, kids are exponentially more than
yes,
dogs. I loathe people who say, "Oh, I have a dog. It's just like a kid." Or my no, stop it. Dogs are great and they teach you responsibility. They are not kids.
yes, they are
Yeah.
stepping the same direction.
Yes.
Those
Right,
kids.
yeah,
I've,
yeah,
ne-
yeah,
I've
yeah.
I had a dog as a kid growing up, so I know a little bit about it. I have a kid now, so I definitely know about that
Yes.
aspect of it.
Yes.
But like then you have kids, or you have some other life form that depends upon you,
Yeah.
and then all selfishness that you ever had has to be wiped out in order for that other life to live, and like that causes you to start thinking in different ways. And like he's saying here, it's like your God can no, even if you're not a Christian, even if you don't believe in any God, like you stop having yourself be the deity, right? Like you might believe like your kid is essentially, and that's in the way that you act, right? But you are now loyal to something outside of yourself, and that's what's key. And I think it's like important that's like a key reality to have in order to understand why libertarianism is so beautiful as a legal theory, why it works so well. And until you have that experience, it's not something that can really be, you can't really like teach it, and you can't really explain it with words, like, and you have to experience it. And the good news for most of history is like everyone really experienced it. It's only until now, right, where we see certain types of people trying to break down the family unit, destroy family institutions and social institutions and things like that, that now we start having like a larger and larger group of people that no longer like have those types of realizations. And so the highest form of conception that they've got is of themselves. It's not of something larger than that. And when that happens, like, yeah, then there is really wacky types of things that occur, regardless of what legal theory you have, even if it's as right and as good as libertarian legal theory, like you're still going to get it wrong. You're still going to be blue pilled, and it's going to be a bad time.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that he hits on too is it's funny because he's using this as an example of what you value beyond it, but I actually think that this betrays a little bit because I don't know that Dave considers himself an atheist anymore, but I don't think he's a full on theist necessarily, or Orthodox Christian in any shape or form. But one of the things he identifies here is he says that there should be things you value way above it: God, family, friends, community, being a decent person. That line to me actually sticks out because that is something that I think the people he's criticizing actually cling to. Because what happens is when you don't have a system like a systematic religion, let's say, you end up saying, well, either your god yourself is your god, or if you tend to be somewhat of a selfless person, then you think, no, I actually think that there are, like, sacrifice is a value that I should have above, but I just think it needs to be being a good person. That's the god that I have. What ends up being, with again, without a religion, you determine what that is, and so in a sense you're your God is your own conception of what good is, which is a reflection of you to some degree. Now, you might think not everything you do is good, and you might fail your own conception, but your perception of what is good is informing your ideal. So, in that sense, you are your own God still.
Yeah.
And what's funny is that there were so many replies that Britt and I were laughing about before we were started recording to this, where people were basically outing themselves, saying, "Nope, God, religion's just man made, and if you reject that, then you're free to choose what you believe, and you don't have to." And then I'm like, okay, so then the God becomes your perception of what you believe, your perception of the world, and in a sense, the conception of yourself. And the way that this gets libertarians in particular, because he identifies them in this way, is that, and I think it leads to his example, is that they elevate and they say, well, the moral thing is not using force and allowing choice. And I think that is a moral thing, right? Not using force uninitiated is a moral thing. However, there are times when using force is a moral thing, as my Christian, religion would say, like, for instance, to stop someone from murdering your brother would be a use of force. Of course, that you might say it's initiated versus uninitiated or whatnot. But there are examples of uninitiated force that you could justify to being ethical in certain situations. But when your entire ethical framework of what becomes your God is this idea of just not using force, then it almost becomes a moral imperative for you to not only allow things to happen, but to be morally neutral or pro those things happening. So, for instance, with the trans example, if your moral framework, if your God is libertarianism alone, then the only thing that matters is if someone is allowed to do it with or without the use of force. And therefore, you can never be against someone morally doing something if it's not done through the use of force. Because if someone freely chooses to become trans, then you have no moral imperative to make a judgment call one way or the other. If anything, your moral judgment is motivated to go pro doing that thing because it was done freely in a free society where people are free to choose what they want to do. So someone choosing to transition is a good thing, and someone choosing not to transition is also a good thing. All things are good if they're done freely. That's your only moral framework.
Yeah.
If libertarianism has become that the only ethical paradigm you have, and
Yes.
that becomes your God, and that's what leads to these goofy situations that Dave Smith talks about here.
And I think that that misunderstanding of where libertarian legal theory fits within your hierarchy of values is also the most powerful criticism of it. And it's not valid because it's a misunderstanding of where it should fit in the values. But if you look at someone like Michael Knowles or Ben Shapiro, one of my friends who's more conservative, this is the type of criticism that he levies. He's like, well, so then anyone should be able to do anything. Like drunk drivers should be able to go out as long as they don't hit anyone. It's okay. And it's like libertarian has nothing to say about that. I'm like, right. And I don't think conservatism should have anything to say. Conservative legal theory should have nothing to say about whether you care about this or that. You impugn your own thoughts onto that and make it seem it should have something to say about that. But you have elevated conservatism Inc. to God tier status when that's not where it's supposed to go. It's just it's a legal theory. And that's Dave Smith does such a good job because he is able to be yeah, there is a moral law that we're supposed to follow, and libertarianism serves that purpose. It serves that. The second libertarianism didn't serve that, I think Dave Smith would drop it. I at least know I would drop libertarianism the second
Right.
I didn't think it actually led to a more moral society. And that's there's obviously time preference within that. I need to disclose, yeah, sometimes if you have a libertarian society in the interim, things do get worse for a little bit because that's just kind of the hangover after everyone's been so high about things, for so long, whether it's with money or the financial system or just certain types of regulations or whatever. But inevitably, I believe that with freedom of choice and free markets and people voluntarily being able to associate with each other, that inevitably leads to good people associating with good people and bad people associating with bad people. And eventually, through their own actions being destroyed or having to become good people. And so in that way, good societies do rise up and good groups of people rise up. And so as much as libertarianism furthers that worldview and furthers and underpins the moral law that I believe in, then it serves it. But like, don't get drawn into this, like, well, libertarianism would just is okay because it has nothing to say about whether you should or should not take drugs, or whether you should or should not be polyamorous, or whether you should or should not be a trans. Like, then it's therefore invalid. It's like, no, you're addressing it on an argument that is not trying to make. It's only trying to make an argument about whether things should be legal or not legal, and not whether or not we should have a viewpoint, whether it's good or bad on one side of it.
You know, it's funny. I'm refreshing my church history reading. I have been for the past year or so, going through these volumes and starting, from the foundation of the church through. And so right now I'm in the Scottish Covenanters era of Presbyterianism being formed in that 1600s. This is a question that has been brought up throughout church history, but it was very focused on, particularly with the Church of Scotland, which was the two spheres theory. And I want to say this was, oh man, I'm blanking on his name right now, but John Knox's pupil, I think, was the one who really brought this to the forefront, being, there are two spheres of authority: the church's authority and the state's authority. And the king is subservient to God and to the church, and to his people, and has no realm in legislating that. And the church has its moral imperative, but also has no role in setting the magistrates or the civil law there in that sense. And it's funny because, it was basically a lot of theologians coming to those theories and conclusions. And it feels like Dave Smith has come to that kind of two spheres theory, but from the political angle, where he's not even, again, necessarily theistic or orthodox in that way, but he's come to that same realization, saying, no, look, like, this legal theory is great, but it has its sphere of what it should mandate and control. And then the value system of higher ethics and morals needs to be above that, and in a separate, and it should inform your legal theory, but they should not necessarily be one-to-one and direct. And so it's just kind of funny to see that parallel there.
Yeah.
All right.
More on this one.
Great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for listening. If you enjoyed this, make sure to share it with a friend, leave a like, give us a comment, and send us your takes. We appreciate it all, and we'll catch you on the next one.